Hello everybody! Today we're going to be starting off the video a bit differently than usual because the first game I'm going to talk about is one that I unfortunately ended up refunding on Steam. Not because it was an entirely trash game made by an idiot of grandeur like the game Salad Junk or whatever the hell that entry-level engine is that everyone uses on Steam. This game was called Mortal Manor, and on par for the series, it was a 2D pixelated Metroidvania game. When I first booted it up, I did think that it had potential, since it had a pretty good art style, it had simplistic combat, which I thought could have gone great places, and it would have eventually opened up with more items, and most importantly, it had an actual plot line, which is kind of required to get me interested in a game. It wasn't much, just something intriguing about the local castle and a reason to go infiltrate it. I started the game and got going, and I started dying a bunch of times right out of the gate. No big whoop, it's a Souls-like attempter, so I kind of expected that. However, I hit the first real problem. The only healing items I got at the start were consumable only. There are no Estus flasks. Big red flag, but I continued. The next few attempts at progress, I tried a couple different paths, and only one of them seemed reasonably possible at the time. At this point, I died around 7 or 8 times, and I started realizing the next red flag. No checkpoints up to that point. I wasn't actually making any progress. I would defeat the enemies, started learning the optimal patterns to deal with them without getting hit, but with no checkpoints found in my travel and no healing items, I ended up getting nowhere. And then I hit the final strike. I managed to locate the first item upgrade, except that it was hidden behind a platforming challenge, surrounded by spikes. Classic deal, so I gave it a shot. Got to the final platform before I got the item, and died in instant death. Got sent back to the start. Finding that weapon upgrade was around 12 to 15 screens between my death and that checkpoint. And at that point, I decided the entire game just wasn't worth it. If it's gonna go that long, without giving me a break on the first leg of the journey, then I couldn't imagine it letting up later. Maybe the game does have a negative difficulty curve, except I'll never know. And what I wanted to say to finish up my thoughts on Mortal Manor is that people often forget, when making Souls-likes, is that Dark Souls, the standard for which they should all strive for, is actually a lot more generous than they think it is. Remember that the first checkpoint you get on your optimal journey is behind like 6 to 8 hollows at best. The first bonfire you're supposed to find is at that first tower in the Undead Settlement, with the shortcut ladder in it that leads to the Red Drake encounter. It's actually pretty close to the start of the game, and then all you have to do from there is get to the first boss in the overworld, which is walk around the houses, climb the nearby towers to kill the archers, and you end up defeating around 10 to 15 hollow soldiers that are actually required. These gameplay sections are objectively pretty short, and you are provided with decent weaponry at the start, almost regardless of your class choice. So, I do think that this is something that people often forget working on these games, is that Dark Souls is actually designed to be encouraging and to push you forwards, even though it will slam you dead at the first opportunity that you did something stupid. Mortal Manor could have been easily changed to be a more palatable game, and I think the easiest change would have been to make the 3 healing potions you get at the start to simply reload upon death. After that, another easy change would have been just to change the damage numbers of the early enemies, space the early checkpoints closer together. There are definitely fans of this game, I saw them on the forums. So, I didn't want to bash it too hard for being overly difficult to start. It does seem outwardly like it was a well-crafted and thought-out indie title, and honestly, with a couple number tweaking, it could have been a great game, but unfortunately, I'm just too busy, so I couldn't really bother myself to force through that sort of wall at the start. With that game back onto Steam, we're going to start talking about the actual topic of today's video, Touhou Luna Nights, which I am glad came out of my randomizer because I did hear about this game quite a few times. It was more prominent than most of the other games on my list, so I was excited to start. After hitting that button, I was immediately dropped into the titular Luna Nights as the main character, Sakuya, a maid who works for an assumedly powerful witch, decided to prank her employee by dumping her in this alternate dimension for some reason. Sakuya needs to track down her mistress so she can figure out what the hell is going on. Thankfully, the intro does do a great job of showing us that despite its name, Team Ladybug wasn't screwing around. The game shows itself as being highly produced, with a higher def pixel art that flows well with its anime girl sensibilities, and the movement animation is well done, along with it having very distinct and unique arenas and backdrops to help set the tone of this weird outer world that deliberately makes no sense. However, there was also a big issue in the beginning of the game. It definitely was not made with newcomers in mind. Hell, through the first half of the game, I didn't even know that this was an adaptation of something else. I simply thought that this was just all OCs running around and doing things. It wasn't until the patchouli boss fight when I finally figured it out, and I only did that because I did remember that name from somewhere and figured that it was from an anime that I never heard of. But it turned out that Luna Nights is actually a crossover of the Touhou games, those famously difficult bullet hell video games that come out once every several years. So beyond the surface level roles, you really aren't given very much character traits to work with, which isn't really a huge detriment since stock characters work well in the Castlevania series, and they do give you enough through the small amount of dialogue and interactions, and the overall character design to give you something to care about. It's just that the lacking story means that there's a cog missing on this game's wheelhouse that really can't be avoided. This game was made for the fans, which I really can't fault it for. But you just know that going into this cold, there isn't a lot of story beats to pick up on and to get invested in beyond the literal words of the plot itself. It's kind of like Blazing Chrome in that regard. They introduce enough mechanics and enough story to newcomers so that they can progress through the game, but they don't give you much reason to care about the characters other than what role they fill. The main character is able to stop time as a combat mechanic, and is essentially a warrior maid who does the literal cleaning of the manor she lives at, on top of defeating invading demons that get too close to the estate. All of the characters are practicing magicians, and some are incredibly powerful, as we'll see later in the game's boss fights. Since this is a Metroidvania, she's also limited the maid's power, and that's how we get started. Bullshit explanation is a go. The game starts very hand-holdy, considering that even though the controls are just the usual standards, there's just a few more things after the tutorial that the game doesn't allude to as being important as it actually is. I can jump, and that's kind of it at the start, and then I find the attack button, the knife throw. It's the maid's signature attack, a simultaneously incredible and limited amount of projectiles. It runs on the character's mana bar, so you can't just throw knives at all your problems all the time. However, you do get enough to play with to have a really fun time throwing blizzards of knives at everyone who looked at me funny, and then picking them off of their corpses. I didn't really need any more magic beyond that. Knife throwing was such a power trip to have a projectile be your normal attack. I just couldn't get over it for the first level. I was having a great time. A little further into that level, you also get introduced to your other major mechanic, Time Stop. Time Stop is a special ability limited just to the maid. No one else can do it. But due to the mistress's manipulation, it can simply slow time, which in of itself is useful in its unique puzzles until she meets our next major character, Luigi, in a mech suit. Well, I'm sure that she has an actual name, but with the hat, Luigi just ended up being her name. It's so obvious that I don't know what they were doing with that character design. Now, it may not look it at the start, since Time Stop is limited to its own mana bar, so it ends up feeling more like a puzzle mechanic a la Zelda, but trust me, Time Stop is an essential boss-killing part of your kit. and it's a greatly used unique mechanic of this game. Since this is a Metroidvania, mixing in some pseudo turn-based stuff where you can pick your shots and unleash devastation from your temporal shield does get used to dish out damage quite a bit and just avoid getting hit with these painful combos. The guys at Team Ladybug did a hell of a lot to flesh out this mechanic, giving you different enemies that are affected in different ways by stopped time, and forcing you to make these split-second decisions during which boss's attack is the best time to use time stop to correctly dodge and unleash hell. And then there are rewards called Gray's bonuses, where you get extra mana and health if you get really close to incoming projectiles, which in some boss fights is an absolute must grab. The late game bosses end up throwing so much crap at you all the time that being able to stop time to get around some of it is essential and intensifies the combat so much more, since you're only allowed a short amount of time to get things done before time resumes, which adds the strategic elements of this game's combat. And it just ended up being the perfect twist on the usual combat that makes this game special, to make time stopping not only just a cool gimmick, but also the partner that you needed to take down this game's cast of witches. The combat of this game is just so well done. It's greatly paced, greatly animated, it has an amazing soundtrack to match the characters of the witches and the tones of their fights. And they have challenging attack repertoires to strategize and be a challenge for you throughout the entire thing. It makes for such an amazing time, super satisfying. Beyond the cadre of great bosses, the Metroidvania elements are pretty standard stuff. You get to expand the usage of your time stop to get through obstacles and enemies, which are also pretty fun to do. They come up with different gimmicks that pair up well to your movement and to your combat model. You get these cute character models and a large number of the enemies to vary up the journey from place to place and give the different sections of Luna Nights their own special feel. And then you continue collecting more items and different attacks to get through those challenges laid out by her mistress. Some of the cooler abilities are a dash that allows you to get to higher areas and fly through the battlefield, eliminating enemies on your way, and then being able to throw knives during time stop to act as platforms, which is just a brilliant way to make the platforming more interesting. On the way, you'll also be picking up these cards that are magic attacks that you can use with your mana bar to unleash devastation on anyone unlucky enough to look at you funny. One of them to keep in mind is the 1,000 Daggers, since it is surprising that it doesn't actually cost a lot of mana to use, especially if you do a lot of grazing during boss fights, and it doesn't seem to be counted on the amount of knives that you can have in play, that limiter, and it also tracks a little bit to the enemy you pointed it at, so it's all around just a good, dependable way to dish out a ton of damage at a moment's notice. I did also use the floating laser sword card later in the game, but it just didn't dish out the damage that I needed depending on how expensive it was to use. Geez, that card. Getting into the later game now, the plot does start to wrinkle a bit as characters show up that seem to have been drafted from the outside world just like Sakuya, and have been employed by her mistress to stop her journey or to make it more difficult as part of the game that she's playing. It starts seeming like there's these outside forces in play trying to usurp the Luna Nights dimension into their own agendas from off-screen. However, while all this is going on around her and answers are finally coming to the table, the all-important mission does not stray from Sakuya's mind as she takes down all comers with her flailing blades simply to find her mistress, which in of itself becomes a bit of a comedy skit when we do eventually catch up with her, appropriately standing on the top floor of Luna Night's clock tower. Apparently she's planned that herself was going to be her final challenge, just to complete the game that she's been playing with Sakuya. While Patchouli before was the first sign that the game was upping the stakes, Romelia the Mistress is just the confirmation as her battle gets close to the definition of bullet hell design. being able to rain down the usual hail of spheres onto the battlefield along with these full rows of magical circles. This is the point where the time stop becomes the killing tool in the Sakuya repertoire, since there's really not a good way to dodge all of her attacks without using it. Along with that is her more dangerous card to pull, the Laser Lattice, which covers half the screen and requires these pinpoint platforming to get away from, or facing the danger of incredibly high damage. Even with the abundant graze bonuses in this fight, you get hit by this attack several times and it can totally destroy your run. It's definitely aiming for that golden standard of being a boss fight as a test of all of your combat skills simultaneously, which is odd considering that Remilia seems to be going for the throat in this scene, while also still thinking that this is all a big game. With her defeat, the game seems to be over as she concedes to her maid's combat skills. However, as you can tell from the fight and from the cutscene, Remilia's mansion has been taken from her as an off-screen villain demands Sakuya to come challenge her next, leading on to the next series of platforming hurdles to jump through. It's some harder gameplay to chew through, and getting the purple key, I believe, took way more attempts than I would like to admit. But whatever, it's a Metroidvania, so we persevere, a certain mortal notwithstanding. And after a final grueling hallway, we finally get to the throne room of the alternate dimension because, well, I guess Symphony of the Night was just that influential. We finally get to see who was behind the ghost mask. Luigi! I guess I'm surprised, but I really shouldn't be since there were only like 7 characters in this game, and half of them were just one throwaways anyway. Luigi's intentions are actually pretty simplistic considering the boss fight that comes after. Pretty much exactly what Remilia was doing. She's simply after all the gems that Sakuya has from her journey. I never mentioned this before, but Luigi was also this game's merchant. Basically the army guy from Aria of Sorrow, who exchanges the gems you'd pick up from enemy kills for power-ups and one-time potions. Frankly, she was a very bad merchant in this game, since her prices were ludicrously high for how many gems you were getting from kills, so I barely bought anything from her. The other big issue is that the gems aren't just normal currency. Depending on how many you had, they also factored into being slight combat boosts as well. So, if what Luigi was selling was unappetizing, why would I bother to part with items that were boosting my health and damage? The whole plot point and gameplay tie-in is going to be really stupid in a second, so just hold on that. Luigi's mech attacks are actually really interesting and pretty challenging to dodge, making for quite the hectic encounter, especially since one of her attacks has to be dodged using the background as a shield, which in of itself is a neat idea. Pretty sloppy on execution though. It's just a fun suite of projectile attacks and sphere-based kicks to the face, but it's pretty much the Remilia fight with more bells and whistles. Another true test of your combat prowess that's let down by how repetitive it is, which makes it a bit too easy to have a strategy put together since the late game bosses are designed to never be able to surprise you. It might take a few tries, but defeating Luigi is surprisingly the easy part. I guess that's kind of the norm for anything attempting to be a Souls-like with its final challenge. And now here comes the big twist. As alluded to earlier by Remilia, Luigi was never designed by her to be a person, simply supposed to be relegated to a radio voice that was scattered around the map to act as a save point. She has no idea what the hell Luigi was doing, and so it's revealed that Luigi was actually a different character in disguise, who intruded on Luna Nights for her personal gain. I have no idea why the collapse of the plot to the denouement was written like this, but this whole twist begins reading like it's the result of a spat between 7-year-old girls. Apparently, in order to produce Luna Nights, Remilia decided to steal her sister's collection of magical gems that Sakuya has been collecting to act as her mana to do so. Obviously, the sister got angry that Remilia used her jewels to create this magical playground for her and her maid, so she stamped right into it in order to seal the pair in the alternate dimension under her own powers in order to get all the gems back. The gems act as her magical essence, so the gameplay twist is that selling too many gems to her actually increases her power in the final boss battle, which is why it's so dumb that Luigi's stock was so uninteresting, since that could have been a cool twist on the gameplay, but it ended up being totally unutilized just because of how terrible it was. To be honest, I don't think her powers are actually affected at all by how many gems you gave away, but it could have been a really cool idea, was right in front of them. And once again, well-designed boss fight that makes use of all your tactics again with a different spin and higher difficulty. This was the boss fight where I had to break out the 1,000 daggers as a standard attack. For a blind first run up until Luigi, it was all still doable with your standard knife attacks, but the sister is so difficult and so covering the screen with all of her attacks that you really need to bring in the 1,000 daggers because of its other absurdly good effect: temporary invincibility. While using the 1,000 daggers attack, you also get a few seconds of invincibility that can be used to dodge through a hard attack when planned accordingly, and at this point the bullet hell has so many circles in it all over the screen that it's really just a needed thing at this point in the game. Otherwise, this fight requires way too much precision to get this done. And once that's over with, the two sisters essentially make up immediately and decide to start including her on their fun excursions in the future, and end up deciding to dispel Luna Nights, leading to a happy clappy ending. I don't really understand why the central plot ended up being so childish, but maybe all of this is just in line with the other Touhou games, that all of the characters act like immature girls.
The game isn't over yet.
There's actually a post-game boss in this game that I decided to bother to do, because it was designed to be possible by normal human beings instead of what Square Enix does. Weird how that happens. The final level in this game is an attempt at overdoing the hard hallways of the throne room level and just stuffed it full of enemies top to bottom. It was getting to the point that at the final run to the extra boss, I was trying to time stop and bullshit my way past all the tough enemies jumping over arches just to get to the boss, because facing whoever that was would have been easier than dealing with that crap. This level is a zone of chaos that is essentially representing Luna Nights beginning to break down due to the overloading of the dimension from all of the magical combat. There's too much magic in Luna Nights, so it's starting to ending up disintegrating, which is what pushes the extra boss to act. Her name is Raimu, and from the way she acts, she seems to be a primary protagonist or antagonist from the Touhou series, who has come to the alternate dimension to dispel it herself. Apparently, Luna Nights has been gaining too much power and has started to affect the real world. Raimu thinks that Remilia has been dragging her feet on ending this little game of hers, so she's come in to slap some sense into her and get this thing done quickly. She pretty much says that to the letter, which is pretty cute. Sakuya thinks that she's being unreasonable and decides to stop her herself so that Remilia can have more time to deal with this. As an extra boss, it's definitely a harder encounter, but again, once you integrate the 1,000 daggers into your platforming dodges and figuring out her patterns, it ends up not being that hard of a final boss to this game, and it's actually completely doable. It's hectic, to be sure, there's a lot of stuff on screen, and her attacks cover the entire damn arena. But keep with it and keep dodging, and you should do fine as long as you shove that important magic card in her face at all opportunities. Once Raimu is defeated, the important characters all show up for the extra areas ending. I'm not sure why, but the extra areas ending is an alternate ending to the whole game, but you can only do it after finishing the regular game, so it's just confusing that there's two side-by-side endings. The sister reveals herself from the Luigi disguise and complains that Luna Nights is the playground that Remilia created for everyone, but making her really pissy that she got cut out of it entirely. But in actuality, Luna Nights was supposed to be a gift given to the sister that everyone was hiding from her to be a surprise. These characters are seriously goddamn 7-year-olds or sitcom characters or both, because holy hell, this is getting really stupid. Anyway, they say that Luna Nights was created as a copy of the real world because for some reason, the sister's full magical abilities are sealed in the real world, so this was supposed to be her space where she can play freely. The Zone of Chaos was an additional part of Luna Nights that wasn't in the original plan of its creation, so it ended up disintegrating completely due to the buildup of magic from their fight. Raimu's plot gets completely forgotten about because no one cares about the implications that Luna Nights' influence has on the real world, and that's really the end of both stories. I really can't say it's not unique, but come on. This is such an immature plot that, like most convoluted comedy stories, could have been easily fixed if everyone sat down for like 10 minutes and listened to everyone else's frustrations. But the story of these games aren't usually the main selling point, so it isn't all that bad that it's really dumb. And for Luna Nights' attempt at indie Metroidvania, they really hit the nail on the head. It's fast-paced and exciting 2D platforming combat, mixed with its quick turn-based mechanic of time stop, really makes this game stand out from its peers. It wouldn't have been as special if it was just relegated to a simple dodge roll, and that's why I ended up really appreciating the time stop. Team Ladybug really thought through the full scope of how to use that mechanic and incorporated it fluidly into regular combat that makes the whole model flow really well in the high-octane setting that they were using. It's such a shame that this game only had 6 bosses total, but the quality is condensed and makes each encounter the highlight that they are supposed to be. Unique to each other, mostly with great art and soundtrack to back it up, that really showed off what we were all here to see. Luna Nights might not have a super extensive map, but for a Metroidvania, its 8 to 10 hour length is as long as it really needs to be, and it has enough cool battle and movement tech to keep you engaged with its gameplay, along with mostly well-planned challenges to make the spaces in the castle and all the levels feel like the satisfying hurdles that they are supposed to be leading up to those brilliant encounters. If you're a fan of the genre, I recommend it highly, and with that, I'll attach my final scores to the video. And wish you all out there a victory for gamers. Thanks for watching.